you're on the distribution list, as soon as we post it to the website, we'll be sending communication letting you know that it's there. First, what I'd like to do is introduce the team who's here today with me. My name is Dr. Edgar Stewart, and I am the manager of the Nonpublic Monitoring Team, and I have 4 team members with me, and I'd like them all to introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Eric Lund. I'm a Nonpublic Program Monitor.
Hi, my name is Allison Lucy. I'm also a Nonpublic Program Monitor.
Good morning. Sharon Powell, Supervisory Education Program Specialist.
Good morning. Juliana Del Arroyo, Director of Special Programs.
Okay. Many of you have experienced the OSSE monitoring process for non-public students in the past, both on the local education agency side and also on the non-public school side. And historically, those visits that we've had have included both a student file desktop review and an on-site visit to the non-public school. So what you're going to be hearing about today is how that process has changed, and we're going to kind of compare and contrast our previous process that we've been using for the last 3, 4, 5 years, and highlight the areas where there will be changes for both the non-public school and the local education agency. It's an interactive presentation, so please, if there are questions that you have, please feel free to type them into the question box, and we'll be allowing questions and answering them as they make sense in terms of the flow of the presentation. Okay, there we go. So over the past 3 years, since 2012, we've had a monitoring process where we've monitored about 18 non-public schools per year, and it's included both findings that were made based on our student file reviews and that the LEAs are responsible for correcting any identified noncompliance, and also non-public school level findings which the non-public schools are responsible for in terms of correcting any identified noncompliance. So as I said, approximately 18 non-public schools were monitored each year over the past 3 years. Just to kind of give you a snapshot of the current look as of April of 2015, we had 1,021 students attending non-public schools from the District of Columbia. Of those, 983 of them were attending schools that were approved by OSSE through the Certificate of Approval process, and approximately, 38 students were attending non-public schools that were not certified by my team. And for those 38 students who were in non-COA approved non-public schools, typically those students are attending based upon placement from another child placing agency in the District of Columbia, for example, Child and Family Services, the Division of Youth and Rehabilitation Services, or Court Social Services. So that 1,021 represents students coming from 33 LEAs attending COA-approved non-public schools, and 2 LEAs have students at non-approved non-public schools. Just to give you a snapshot of what we've done in terms of selecting the number of student files that we review each year, we have a formula that we use. And as you can see here, in that formula, depending on the number of students with IEPs that an LEA has, we select a certain number of files that we will be reviewing as part of the on-site monitoring visit. So if you look at the 3-year average over the past 3 years, we have on average selected 446 total student files that we reviewed over that last 3 years. So this will be important as we introduce the revised monitoring process to kind of give you a sense of the scale of our review and the scope of our review of student level files going forward starting this year. So as you see here, over the past 3 years, we have reviewed 446 student files. The major revision to this monitoring process at the student level in terms of selecting students, the number of students to review, instead of using that formula, we're now going to be using an approximate sample of 10% of all non-public students and with representation from all LEAs who have students in non-public schools across all non-public schools. So going back to the, the 983 numbers in terms of April of 2015, so we had 983 students at that time who were attending non-public schools in COA-approved non-public programs. So the approximate 10%, as we're looking at it for the next 3 years, would be about 98 students, or a total of 294 students over the 3-year total going forward. So what you can see when you compare where we had been at 446 students over the past 3 years compared to an approximate sample of 98 students each year for a 3-year total of 294, we're essentially going to be reviewing a third less students. So, in terms of the implications of that, first thing that you might think of is, if we're reviewing fewer students, is there a concern about, does OSSE have any concerns, does the LEA have any concerns, does the Department of Education, OSEP, have any concerns about our ability to identify noncompliance, even though we're only reviewing 2/3 of the number of students that we historically had been reviewing? The answer to that question for us is no, and we'll get into several different ways of presenting the information to help you to really understand the implications of that in terms of being able to identify noncompliance. I see there's a question. Is it 10% across all students or 10% of the students from each LEA? So it's an approximate 10% overall sample. Part of what is important, we're going to be using a stratified random sample selection process, and that will ensure that we have the ability to have representation of each LEA and also each non-public school in the sample. So we say approximate 10%, so it may be that for a particular non-public school or a particular LEA, that number will be a little bit more or a little bit less depending on our stratification selection sampling process. So if an LEA has 11 students at a non-public at different non-public schools, it may be that we review 1 or 2 files. It may be up to 2 or 3 files, depending again on the random selection stratified sampling process. So hopefully that answers the question. So historically in our past process, we have planned a visit, engaged, and gone on an on-site monitoring visit, and that's included both a review of student files and a desktop review using our student level tool, along with a review of documentation and policies, observations and interviews that we record in our non-public school level tool. And this is a yoke process, so essentially it's occurring simultaneously. If there are any identified areas of non-compliance using each tool, historically we have released reports and implemented a 1-year timeline to make corrections for those identified areas of non-compliance. So on the student level side, using the student tool, the LEA, in conjunction with the non-public school, was responsible for implementing any corrections for identified non-compliance, and for any findings that occurred in the non-public school level tool, the non-public was solely responsible for making corrections. As part of that process, OSSE has verified the correction of student level identified non-compliance and school level non-compliance as well. So another way to think about this, when we're looking at it kind of from a monitoring tool view, we have both a non-public school level tool and the student level tool. They're administered simultaneously as part of the on-site monitoring visit. As I said, approximately 18 schools per year. And you see here the LEA is responsible working with the non-public to correct any identified non-compliance from the student level review, and the non-public is responsible for correcting school level identified non-compliance. So let's look at that in terms of a specific example. One of the items on the student level tool is that incident reports from incidents of restraint and seclusion are required to be uploaded into the student's permanent record in SEDS within 24 hours. On the student level side, in terms of looking at this item on the student tool, if there was identified non-compliance, the non-public, the LEA would get the finding per that student file review. The identified non-compliance would be corrected, and the corrective actions, you see here there are two, the non-public would be required to upload the incident report into SEDS and revise their policies and procedures accordingly. On the school level tool that went to the non-public school, there would be a finding for the non-public school, and again, the non-public school would be responsible for revising the policies and procedures. One major impetus of this revised monitoring process was to kind of clean this process up a little bit and make it more clear and delineate the responsibility in a way that's more direct than it had been previously. And we'll get into that in just a few minutes, and you'll see the contrast to what we're implementing going forward. So over the next 3 years, we will be disentangling the student file desktop reviews from the on-site monitoring visits. And as you see here, the implications of that are that in each school year, we still will be conducting approximately 18 on-site monitoring visits to non-public schools. And you see here across 3 years, Group A, Group B, and Group C. And those will be occurring separate from the desktop reviews, where we will be reviewing an approximate 10% sample of the total population of students attending non-public schools in each year, separate from the on-site monitoring visit. So just to kind of take that back and help you think about it in a different way. We'll use an example with an LEA who in 2013, 2014 had students who were attending 17 different non-public schools throughout that year. And those same schools were slated to receive on-site monitoring visits from OSSE. In our past process, we would have reviewed student files as part of the visit and then released our identified findings at the school level in a student level report. So this particular LEA would have had to correct the identified noncompliance for student file reviews at each of those schools. So as you see here, this particular LEA was lucky enough to have students who were at all 17 non-public schools that were monitored in 13-14, and it meant that they had multiple year-long timelines for correction of noncompliance. So as you see, in the first non-public school that was monitored, the report was released in September of 2014, and the student level findings that were identified would be required to be corrected within 1 year, so essentially September 2015. So as you look at that, going all the way down, one LEA has 17 different year-long timelines that they were responsible for keeping straight, identifying the corrections that need to be made within a timely manner. So, it's a process that LEAs and non-public schools managed to be able to negotiate, but what we saw is that there was room for improvement here. So again, another way to look at this is that in our past process, there were 3 LEAs who had students who their files were reviewed as part of the first non-public visit where we released the findings in September. So essentially, those 3 LEAs were responsible for making corrections. As you see, going down to the second non-public school that we visited in this example, where we released the findings in December, you'll see LEA 1 is listed again. So now they have 2 timelines that they're managing. Going to January, non-public school 3 was visited. LEA 1 again has findings that they're now responsible for. So, it's another way of kind of graphically depicting the same information that LEAs with the number of students who they had attending a non-public school in a particular year may have multiple timelines for identified correction that needed to be managed. So going back to what this looks like in terms of our current process, what we're calling our revised monitoring tool framework. As I said, the student-level monitoring tool and the student-level desktop reviews will be disentangled from the on-site visit to non-public schools. So 3 times per year, within the year, we will be conducting student desktop reviews. Those student file reviews will be done annually, and again, using a 10% sample that includes representation from all LEAs with students attending non-public schools and represents all non-public schools. The LEA will be responsible for any corrections from student-level desktop reviews, and the 1-year timeline is still in effect for corrections, including prong 2, which we'll get to in a little bit. So those review periods will be taking place in November. Actually, the reviews will be taking place in October, January, and April, with the release period scheduled for November, February, and May. And we will continue to visit non-public schools, approximately 18 per year, throughout the year, and any identified noncompliance will be, the non-public school will be required to correct that noncompliance, and there may be individualized timelines for the corrections. So I want to stop here and see if we have any more questions. Let's see. So one question, what do we mean by desktop reviews? Good question. So in looking at the monitoring tool, the student-level file reviews are based on primarily regulations, the federal regulations from the CFR, IDEA regulations. There are also some specific questions coming from the DCMR related to attendance and restraint seclusion. And the desktop reviews are conducted, essentially, the OSSE staff is not required to be physically present at the non-public to conduct those reviews, and we're able to conduct those reviews, here at the office, going into the student's educational record in SES to identify documentation that supports either a compliant file or a non-compliant file for the student-level item. So essentially, desktop reviews don't require us to be on-site at the non-public school to conduct our file reviews. Let's see. Question about the copy of the presentation. We sent it out right before the presentation started. I'm happy to send it again afterwards as well. How will non-publics be notified as to whether their student file was selected for a desktop review? One of the documents you all should have received this morning, and we'll be, again disseminating it after the presentation and placing it on the OSSE website, is the monitoring calendar for the 2015-2016 school year, which includes all of the identified dates for non-public on-site visits, as well as information for the LEAs in terms of the 3 review periods and report release periods throughout the year, and which LEAs are assigned to each of those clusters. Let's see. Well, the non-public be told about the review or the corrections that are needed. So part of what this process is designed to increase is the collaboration between the non-public school and the LEA. And one of the key areas where we see that collaboration is essential is in preparing for the desktop reviews. So both LEAs and non-public schools will be given sufficient advance notice as to when we will be conducting our desktop reviews, and we encourage the non-public school and the LEAs to use the student tool to look at those files before OSSE conducts the desktop reviews. We've seen instances in the past year where an LEA has worked with a non-public school in advance of the monitoring visit to review their files using the same tool, the student monitoring tool that we're going to be using, and it looks like we're able to see that based upon that advanced review, lower levels of noncompliance was identified, or if you really kind of think about this glass half full, more significant levels of compliant special ed practice was demonstrated. Sorry, just reading some of these questions here. Question, for the clarity, is the desktop review for all schools on the monitoring calendar and those that are not? So the monitoring calendar includes, so we have 3 review periods that we're going to be conducting desktop reviews, October, January, and April. And depending on which cluster or which review period an LEA is assigned to, we'll be looking at, in advance of each of those clusters, whether those LEAs actually have students at that time who are attending non-public schools. And there'll be sufficient notification for both the LEA and the non-public school to prepare for that review. So the information about this year's on-site non-public school visits, all 18 of them, is also included in the calendar so that the non-public school, again, will have sufficient notice as to when those on-sites will be reviewed. So for LEAs who have a significantly large number of students attending non-public schools, and what we picked was 25 or greater students attending non-public schools, any LEA who falls into that category will undergo desktop review 3 times. So basically across all 3 review clusters in the year, since we need to be able to look at a higher number of student file reviews, and we'll essentially be doing that, really breaking it up, 1/3 of the total files reviewed from that LEA in each review period. If a non-public school serves both Maryland and DC students, Which students do you count when determining how many files to review? You know, it's a good question. I mean, essentially, the way the stratification process works is that it's a two-step process where we essentially assigned random numbers to the list of students, and when we do the first round, and let's say we're looking at non-public representation from the non-public schools, we will identify and assign random numbers, and then essentially rank those random numbers, and then select representation, at least one student from each non-public school, and then we'll use the same process, and now we'll be selecting students who come from each LEA. So the final population, the sample of students who we'll end up reviewing may have been selected because they either were selected on the LEA first pass, the non-public second pass, or because in fact they were selected in both the LEA and the non-public passes. So at the end of the day, you know, there will be student representation across all LEAs and non-public schools, so the location of where those students is really less important in comparison to, you know, the representation from respective schools and non-public schools. All right, I'm going to kind of pause and just move on a little bit, and then we can come back to some of these questions. So going back to the example before, we were looking at a specific item on the student level tool. Incident reports are supposed to be uploaded to SEDS within 24 hours. Now, on the student level tool, the LEA gets the finding as before, but you see here now the corrective action is more specific to what the LEA has control over and, you know, is able to do themselves. The LEA will provide technical assistance to the non-public school to ensure the timely upload of incident reports, and they will collaborate with the non-public to ensure that those incident reports are uploaded to SEDS. So this is going to, on the LEA side, facilitate more communication between the non-public school and the LEA to ensure on a regular basis that for this particular area, incident reports are uploaded to SEDS in a timely manner. So the LEA gets the LEA finding based upon the review of the student file. And then on the non-public school tool, the same item, the non-public school would now be responsible, if there was identified noncompliance in this area, for uploading the incident in SEDS and also revising their policies to ensure the timely uploading of incident reports into SEDS. So it's a bit cleaner and ultimately facilitates more active collaboration between the LEA and the non-public school. So here's another way to kind of really graphically depict what we've already talked about. In our process going forward, an LEA will have one cycle of correction. So if in the student file review that is conducted in October, or in this case, let's say September, where we released the report in September 2014, an LEA has 1 year to make corrections, so through September 2015, only one timeline for them to manage in terms of the correction of noncompliance process. And identified noncompliance will be across students likely coming from multiple non-public schools, but will be integrated into one report, which helps the LEA to be able to look at, are there patterns in terms of compliant practice or non-compliant practice that need to be strengthened or continued depending on which direction. Where this process, we felt like, also significantly improved the implications for correcting identified noncompliance is in the prong 2 process. So previously, an LEA might have had students who were attending 3 different non-public schools in a year where they were monitored. What it meant was that after the initial identified noncompliance was corrected in each of those student files across the 3 schools, a subsequent file review of different students from that LEA attending that those non-public schools needed to be conducted. Given that most LEAs have very low numbers of students who are attending non-public schools, the prong 2 process, or that subsequent file review of additional student file reviews in the identified areas of noncompliance, LEAs typically, we exhausted the number of students that we were reviewing, and the prong 2 process closed because we had no more students to review for that subsequent file review, which meant that the prong 2 process, which is designed to ensure systemic correction of areas of identified noncompliance, was limited. In the new process going forward, because the focus of the report is the LEA rather than the intersection of the LEA at non-public 1, non-public 2, non-public 3, the LEA now has the ability, and OSSE has the ability in the student file reviews that we do for prong 2, to pull and review student files from that LEA for other non-public schools where they have students. So as you see here in this example, LEA 1 had 2 student files that were reviewed, and there was identified noncompliance, and those 2 student files came from 2 different non-public schools. What it meant is that the non-public students who were attending different schools, and that's non-public 3 through 7, we now have the ability to use those student files for our subsequent file review, and in that process, the LEA then has the ability, before we do that subsequent file review, to review those students' files at non-public 3 through 7 and make any corrections that need to be made, and it really increases the systemic compliance across the LEA's practice. So I'm going to stop here and look for some additional questions. The monitoring tool, I was questioning about where can we get the monitoring tool for the desktop reviews. We disseminated it before this webinar, and we'll be disseminating it again afterwards. And it will be placed on the OSSE website as well. So to be sure I understand, once the student files are selected, both the LEA and the non-public will be informed that the file has been selected prior to the review beginning. Absolutely. You know, our process is designed to be consistent and transparent. So, you know, both the LEA and the non-public school will have sufficient advance notice of any review periods on the student file review period and also on the non-public on-site visits well before those visits will take place. We will also be providing specific information about the student files that we'll be reviewing in advance as well, so that both the non-public and the LEA can use that to not only look at and make any corrections in those identified students that we will be reviewing, but also with an eye towards our subsequent file pull as part of prong 2 to look at those files as well. For the on-site visit, will only the non-public monitoring tool be used? Yes. Okay, so that looks like all the questions. So just to make, so we've talked about really trying to kind of make attribution of responsibility more clearly delineated in the student tool and the non-public school tool in terms of correction of noncompliance. We also talked about reducing the number of multiple correction year-long correction periods that LEAs had to manage. The third major benefit of this revised process is being able to look at an LEA's practice across time. So what does that look like? In this example here, LEA 1, in year 1, here are some select areas of identified noncompliance. We see that across a number of files reviewed, ESY or students' extended school year determinations being individually determined, there was a significantly high level of noncompliance, and these are arbitrary kind of levels at this point in terms of this example. So we saw a noncompliance rate of 75%. For related services documentation for LEA 1, in this example, there's a 72% rate of noncompliance. So you see all of the fonts that's highlighted in red, you know, for the purpose of this example, we're calling these significantly high rates. Other areas of identified noncompliance for LEA in year 1, measurable annual related service goals, there was a 40% noncompliance rate, and progress reports, there was a 53% noncompliance rate. So let's look at this. Oh, and lastly, physical restraints conducted in non-emergency circumstances, 69% noncompliance rate. So let's look at what this implication looks like when we come back in the second year and we're conducting our student file reviews of files coming from the same LEA as in year 1. We see that the non-compliance rates for determining extended school year on an individual basis went down from 75% to 58%. Related services non-compliance increased from 72% in the first year to 81%. And then measurable annual related service goals significantly decreased from 40% to 22% in the second year, and then you see some of the other areas dropped off completely. So this revised process enables us to look at trends across years for an LEA when we're conducting our student file reviews, and be able to have more data to inform our targeted attention and support for the LEA. So what that looks like in year 1. So all the areas of noncompliance that were identified in that example for year 1 for that LEA are on the left-hand side here. And you see the corrective actions listed for each area. So let's start with measurable annual related service goals. That was an area, if you recall, that was in the black font. So what we said was that that was a moderate level of noncompliance, and you see that the corrective action is only the corrective action that's included in the monitoring tool itself, and the timeline for correction there is 1 year. Same with progress reports. It was an acceptable level of noncompliance requiring only monitoring tool corrective action. And when I say acceptable level, all I mean by that is not requiring additional corrective actions, as you'll see here in some of these other examples. So now, going back to ESY determinations on an individual basis, since that was a particularly high area of noncompliance in year 1, OSSE identifies some additional corrective actions to try and help support the LEA in their practices. And this particular corrective action, reviewing the OSSE ESY policies, the guidance documents, and the webinar documents, was the additional corrective action that was identified. And the timeline you see here for number 2 is 45 days. So again, the default corrective action, there's a 1-year timeline for correction in this area, and the additional corrective action that's included has a much shorter timeline. And the goal here in these shorter timelines is really to help the LEA to, correct any informational gaps or practice gaps that they have in a short period of time, so that improved compliance can be implemented really before the school year is done. Let's go down to the last one, physical restraints in non-emergency circumstances. So this was an area where we looked at LEAs, and we looked at there were significantly high levels of noncompliance in year 1, and because there's also some significant safety issues regarding physical restraints being conducted in non-emergency circumstance, OSSE identified multiple corrective actions. So again, the first one, monitoring tool corrective action will always be the default corrective action with a 1-year timeline for correction. But OSSE identified 3 additional corrective actions. Focus monitoring, which would be an additional file pull and perhaps interviews with LEA staff and non-public school staff to really try to kind of get to the bottom and understand better, at a root cause level, what's going on and why are students being restrained in non-emergency circumstances. There may be a technical assistance session that is also conducted, and you'll see here that each of these timelines for these 2, focus monitoring and the technical assistance session, have shorter timelines. And depending on the results of focus monitoring and the technical assistance session, there may be an additional corrective action plan that's implemented if necessary. So I'm going to come back to that slide. So again, looking at LEA 1 in year 2, we saw that ESY compliance rates increased, or in this case, non-compliance rates decreased. So the default corrective action is all that's required in year 2, and again, that has a 1-year timeline. Since related services, which was significantly high in the first year, increase in the second year in terms of levels of non-compliance, OSSE identified not only the default corrective actions on the tool, but also additional corrective actions that included a technical assistance session and a review of the related services documentation video from the non-public monitoring team's February 26, 2015 webinar. And again, you see those timelines are much shorter, really designed to facilitate a rapid turnaround in terms of increasing compliance in this area, compliant practice in a short period of time. So this model essentially gives us the ability to use data to target our attention and support for an LEA and in terms of our based on our student file reviews across years to help improve practice. One of the goals of this process is to not only be able to target increased attention and support for LEAs where there are significant concerns about levels of noncompliance, but also help provide the fodder for helping us think about how we might scale back the intensity of our monitoring and our desktop reviews where LEAs are able to demonstrate significantly high levels of compliant practice, both within a year and across years. So how does this student file review process across years relate to the non-public school? So you recall that one of the areas in this example was that physical restraints were conducted in non-emergency circumstances. And again, the focus of the corrective actions on the student level tool, the LEA is responsible for, but there are also implications for the non-public school's practices. And based upon student file reviews and the information coming from them and any other corrective actions, whether they're technical assistance sessions, additional focus monitoring, will provide us with some information and data that we can use then to prescribe additional supports to the non-public schools in terms of their practices, understanding that in this particular example, the non-public school is actually not slated to be reviewed in terms of their on-site visit until the 3rd year, but before we get there, we've got 2 years to be able to be informed by the data from our student file reviews and provide support and technical assistance to the non-public schools before we actually get out to that 3rd year, which really helps us to be able to increase the likelihood that by the time we're there in the 3rd year, whatever those non-compliant practices are have been reduced or eliminated, or actually eliminated in this case, before we get out there for formal monitoring in the third year. So I'm going to stop here again and look and review the questions to see where you all are. Oh, very good question. So the question is, are the trends actually comparable when we have different non-public partners each year, and from my experience, different levels of compliance by each non-public school, despite the LEA's efforts? Great question. So at the crux of this, the LEA has students who are attending multiple non-public schools, and if there are different levels of compliance, different levels of practice and experience, that non-public schools are demonstrating, really the first line of intervention is the LEA's ongoing and increased efforts to collaborate with the non-public school. This process helps to facilitate that, but by no means do we believe that the LEA can engage in this process by themselves, which is why the non-public program managers on the OSSE Nonpublic Monitoring Team are available for consultation and guidance and support. And we're here in the capacity not only as monitors, but also to provide guidance, support, information about the regulations, and also to support LEAs in working with non-publics. All of my team can convey, and they have conveyed, instances where one of the two stakeholders, whether it's the LEA or the non-public school, they've experienced challenges with, and we've served in the role of trying to help facilitate improved collaboration, reminding both the LEA and the non-public of the regulations where there may be knowledge gaps, and supporting each of the stakeholders as we deem is necessary in a situation. Typically speaking, like a parent, what we try to do is to let both the non-public and the LEA really work on those relationships and their collaboration actively and directly. And where we're required to kind of step in to assist, what we ask first is to provide us with information about the extent to which each of the stakeholders has collaborated with the other, to really make sure that we're not stepping in to take over what really should be active relationships that haven't been managed effectively. I'm wondering how you account for those changes of non-public locations within the LEA. So if I understand this question, what we'll be doing is looking at and selecting our student files in advance of the review period. So if we do our student file selection on October 1st for the first review period, and on October 2nd that student moves to a different non-public school, we'll have to look at whether we would still select that student if the LEA remained the same. Where the significant difference would be is if the student's parent moved that child's LEA of enrollment to another LEA. We understand that there are change of locations going on all the time, and they may have implications. This is designed to be, like I said, a transparent and consistent process. If there are things that you flag for us in terms of concerns about where students are, or students are moving in locations, we can certainly consider that information when we engage in our selection process. At the start of this presentation, Juliana Del Arroyo introduced herself, and she's the Director of Special Programs. So one of the benefits of having her at, kind of leading the helm of this process is that she's also overseeing the non-public placement team as well. So we really have a kind of direct route to really getting, up-to-the-minute information about where students are moving, in terms of changes in placements or changes in location. Let's see, what restraint videos are you referring to? On the OSSE website, and we'll provide some links to that in the email that we send out, this team conducted an informational webinar in February where we covered 3 different areas where there was a pattern of significantly high levels of noncompliance in our previous year's monitoring visits. Those areas included restraint seclusion implementation, documentation and follow-up, attendance notification, and also related services documentation. So we provided both a PowerPoint presentation and the recorded modules, and they're actually broken up by each of those topic areas, so you're not really forced to sit through a whole presentation or try to find areas that are relevant for you. So the restraint video is one of those modules. Generally speaking, do the non-public schools have one person who enters all of that information into SEDS, or do non-publics generally have numerous people entering that data? You know what? That's a great question, and I don't know that we have a comprehensive answer to that, but I think really what this question illustrates is that that's information that the LEA can use as fodder for conversation with the non-public to really get a sense of who's entering that information in, for what purposes. I know at some non-public schools there are staff who are specifically responsible for one aspect of IEP data, whether that's attendance, whether that is progress reports and report cards, scheduling meetings. But at another non-public school, depending on the size and depending on their model or their staffing, they may have only one person who's responsible for that. But again, that's fodder for discussions with the non-public school about what's relevant to an LEA based upon their needs. On the non-public monitoring calendar, there are 3 clusters for LEAs. Does that mean you will be monitoring all of the student files of the students in the LEA at non-public schools? What it means is, so for example, if an LEA was listed in the first cluster, which would be scheduled for a file review in October, and the report would be released at the beginning of November, we would look at the beginning of October, does that LEA have students attending non-public schools? And then we'd look at the number of students that they have attending non-public schools. If it's less than 25, we will, based upon our approximate 10% sampling, select the number of student files from that LEA to review as part of that first review period. I hope that answers the question. Can you please repeat where the modules will be found? We'll send out links to that in our follow-up email. I think we've gotten to all the questions. Yeah, it looks like we've gotten to all the questions, so I'm going to move on. So Alice and Lucy will talk to you about overall about the benefits of this revised monitoring process.
The next two slides, they just go over, they basically highlight the benefits. But really briefly, the big thing is that the reports have been separated. So you'll now only have reports that cover the areas that you are responsible for. For non-publics, that would be the COA regulations or Chapter 28 of the DC municipal regulations. And for LEAs, that would mostly be the CFR, which is tied to IDEA, and those portions of the DCMR that state the LEA responsibilities for their students in non-publics. Another benefit is that there will be fewer student files reviewed all over. This will affect the LEAs with lots of students at non-publics much more than it will affect those LEAs with fewer students. And depending on an LEA's non-public student population, this might increase the frequency at which a given student's file is reviewed. So what I mean by that is we'll be doing this every year. And so in the past, if you were an LEA that had a few students at non-publics and those students were not attending non-publics that were on the monitoring calendar, you wouldn't hear anything from us. Whereas now, going forward, you will be hearing from us on an annual basis, so long as you have students enrolled in non-publics, or not enrolled, attending non-publics. Please excuse that. But the biggest benefit, I think, is going to be the number of reports that you'll receive on an annual basis. Some of you might have only been getting, some of the LEAs might have only been getting 1 or 2 or 3 reports on an annual basis, but several of you were getting upwards of 10, and some as many as 15 or 16 reports on an annual basis. Now the most anybody will get will be 3, which is great. And then tied to that, it was not uncommon in years past for we're visiting these non-publics every other week or every week, and so it was not uncommon to have multiple reports released from multiple staff members within a few days of each other. And when that would happen, you know, an LEA would be talking to me on the phone, and then they would be talking to one of the other monitors on the phone about students at different non-publics. And now that'll be eliminated. So you'll have 1, maybe 2 staff people responsible for all of the files that are released in a given chunk. So you shouldn't have to be dealing with any more than 1 of us for any of the release periods. So I think that I would imagine that that would be a lot easier for the LEAs.
Next slide.
Yeah. And these are just some more benefits. So. And then this next slide here talks about our upcoming training, which we have scheduled in October. So during these trainings, we'll be going through a fake sample student file. I say fake because we don't want there to be any issues with FERPA. So we'll show you exactly how we are determining if something is or is not compliant. So this will help to ensure compliance on the front end, but I'm also pretty sure that it'll help with the systemic correction of noncompliance or PONG 2. So everybody should definitely look forward to those invitations and then sign up for that training. I think it'll be really useful.
So just a note on that. So this training, as Allison said, is really designed to provide an in-depth overview, an in-depth analysis of the student file review process using the student compliance monitoring tool. It's going to be conducted in advance of the first review period. We plan to repeat the same training 2 other times throughout the year in advance of the January review period and also the April review period as well. So if you're an LEA who's assigned to the 3rd review period in April, don't feel like you have to sign up for the October 1 training. There will be additional opportunities. It behooves those LEAs especially and the non-public schools who are serving those students to participate in the October 1st training, as that will be the only opportunity to go through the student compliance monitoring tool in depth before the first review period.
But it's good for everybody to go to the October one, because then you can make sure that you are doing all of your IEP meetings and eligibility determinations that are held between that training and when we are reviewing your files. You'll make sure that you're doing them compliant.
Great.
In a compliant fashion.
That's a great, yeah, great point. Thank you.
But if you can't make it, it's not the end of the world. Nothing is the end of the world.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through some additional questions. Thank you, Allison. What supports are given from the OSSE when having a difficult conversation about non-publics not updating related service notes or other aspects of what's required under the COA regulations? Great question. Again, you know, OSSE's expectation is that the non-public school and the LEA are having active, ongoing, collaborative discussions to ensure that there is compliant documentation, that it's timely, it's complete, and it's accurate. And, you know, how that gets worked out is part of the discussion that the non-public school and the LEA should be having, and it behooves both partners to have those discussions at the beginning of the year so the roles are clear, and even more so to develop a written document that can be used as the basis of understanding who's responsible for what in what particular timeline. When those relationships don't seem to be able to ensure compliant practice, and one of the stakeholders, whether it's the LEA or it's the non-public, is concerned about that, again, I invite you all to pick up the phone and call OSSE. We're happy to work with LEAs and non-publics to really try to problem solve those issues. You know, again, first and foremost, what will be important to us to really is to get a context of what the extent of the communication and collaboration has been. The standard that we use internally when we are interacting with non-public schools and with LEAs is on a particular issue, 3 attempts made by 2 different modalities. So picking up the phone, calling a non-public school or an LEA, also sending emails. There may be a formal letter that's written, and depending on what the issue is, you know, my staff also will conduct site visits. So they may be pop-up visits if there's a particular concern about safety, or they may be announced and planned visits. So, you know, what we're asking when you're reaching out to us is to be able to characterize the nature of the problem that you're having and the extent to which you've been communicating with the other stakeholder. And when that's happened, we're happy to support, you know, stakeholders in ensuring compliant practice. You know, and that support can be reminding the other stakeholder about the regulations, providing some guidance around or some suggestions around, you know, alternative ways to handle a situation, all the way up through formal corrective actions, technical assistance sessions, either by phone or in person, formal corrective actions also including for non-public schools, you know, changes in their COA status. So, you know, we have all those tools available, but really, you know, the first level of expected practice is active, ongoing collaboration between the non-public school and the LEA. Let's see, going through. So we've got about 20 more minutes. So as I go through this, I don't know that I'm seeing any more questions.
Also, you know, this is a lot of information, and so just so everybody's clear, you feel free to contact us after this webinar if you have specific questions about a particular student or a particular LEA or a particular non-public, and we're happy to go through all of this more in depth or with concrete examples.
Oh, thank you, Allison. Another question, can I assume that the reports will be shared via DC CATS? Yes, so DC CATS is our online system CAT stands for the Corrective Action Tracking System. The majority, I'm sure all LEAs, I think, at this point, and with the exception of 2 or 3 non-public schools, have already been introduced to DC CATs from previous monitoring visits. The online system enables OSSE to have a repository for releasing the reports of identified noncompliance, both from the student tool and from the non-public school tool. It provides the vehicle by which the LEAs and the non-public schools demonstrate corrections for identified noncompliance, and we're able to track it. The expectation here also is, as most of you already know, that whatever identified noncompliance is identified in each respective reports, well, at the student level, is also corrected in the student's SEDS file as well. But the system of record for documenting corrections, from a compliance perspective, that we're able to show external stakeholders like OSSEP is DC CATs. But the expectation is that for student level identified noncompliance, it's corrected in the student's file in SEDS and also demonstrated in DC CATs. Yes, good point. I know it might not be likely to change the training date, but it is scheduled just a few days before the child count deadline, which I imagine will be challenging for LEAs. Yeah, unfortunately, in terms of looking at the calendar, both for internal OSSE activities and also trying to be sensitive to LEAs and non-public's calendars, we really were limited in the number of days that we had available to us. The beginning of the school year, whether that's August or September for both LEAs and non-publics, is also quite challenging, and we wanted to be respectful to recognize that during those first 4 to 6 weeks, your attention, rightly so, would be focused elsewhere, and October 1 was in that way an ideal date. Our goal is to also record that session as well. We're still working out kind of the logistics of that because it's going to be a planned face-to-face training. So there may be opportunities for those who are unable to attend, who are scheduled for desktop reviews in October. Maybe we will be able to provide a recording of the session, but at this point, that's not set in stone. So we're still working that out.
But I promise I'll make it with your while.
And with that promise, how can anyone not attend? The October 1 training is face-to-face.
No, about that October training, we did something similar last year with an LEA. It was just, you couldn't do it across LEAs because of the FERPA issues, which is why this year we'll be creating a fake student. But I think that really did lead to an increase in compliance across the files. That's definitely my perception, and people in the room are shaking their heads yes that they agree with me. So, yeah,
I would agree.
Yeah, it's definitely beneficial.
Another question: when you say LEAs, are you referring to what used to be called progress monitors? LEAs may have their own terms. So either the District of Columbia Public Schools or any of the charter schools may have a person who is designated responsible for monitoring compliance and student progress for their students attending a non-public school. I know DCPS, their staff who were designated in those roles, they call them progress monitors. Typically for the charter schools, I've not heard them referred to as progress monitors, but their formal titles have been education directors or LEA representatives or special education coordinators. Essentially, as you'll see as you saw in the invitation to this webinar, we've identified them on the LEA side as individuals responsible for ensuring compliance and monitoring student progress for their students attending non-public schools.
And this is Juliana. When we, as a state education agency, say LEA, we are referring to the local education agency, so it's not to a specific, so we're speaking to the school as a whole, and then the school can definitely identify the representatives, but we speak to the entire school.
So there's another question, not specifically related to the revised monitoring process, but can you provide clarity in regard to related service trackers? Do they require signatures? As a best practice, we fax them in weekly. Are there any updates in this area? So this is actually one of the questions that was asked, I think a couple of times, and folks were not convinced of our answer in the February 26th webinar. Related service, from an OSSE perspective in terms of OSSE policy, related service trackers do not require signatures. However, an LEA may require above and beyond signatures as part of their related services documentation policies. So if there's a question that a non-public school has about what's required in terms of related service trackers, OSSE's minimum policy does not require signatures on them. However, you're advised to check with each respective LEA whose students you're serving. Could you release the other two training dates so that we can determine if we have to go in October or will be available to attend a later meeting? You know, we'll try to do that in the next couple of weeks. At this point, you know, we've been gearing up for the implementation of this revised process and starting our on-site monitoring visits. So it's on the multiple list of things to do in the next 2 or 3 weeks or so. So as soon as we have more clarity on that, we'll certainly push that information out, really with the goal of getting it out to you in enough time to decide whether you can sign up for the October 1 training or not. Another question. If you are a public charter school and no longer have students attending a non-public, will you still be included in the monitoring that your LEA has scheduled for that year? If you don't have students attending non-public schools, then the answer is when we conduct our selection for a particular review period, if you do not have students attending a non-public at that time, then no, you will not be required as a LEA to participate in you know, that student file review process. Oh, great question. So you were suggesting that the LEA and the non-public placement have a written agreement of the different responsibilities, such as an MOU. Do you have a template for such a written agreement? You know, this question came up last year, and it was something that, you know, has been on our to-do list. We don't have a template at this point. You know, it's one of the areas that we've been in conversations with our colleagues in training and technical assistance here to use one of the bi-monthly non-public POC webinars to facilitate a discussion on. But just to give you context on that, so you know, I hope the language from today's presentation was clear in our intent for the collaborative relationships that non-public schools have with LEAs. At the foundation of that relationship is an expectation of compliant practice per federal regulations, DCMR regulations, both the COA regulations and others like attendance or discipline. So that's at the core foundation of our expectations about that collaborative relationship. When it comes specifically to, oh, and also I should say local policies as well, so like the related services documentation, ESY policies, all of those. Above that, how non-publics and LEAs decide who is responsible for what and who will conduct what particular activities, we really leave that up to the LEA and the non-public, each respective dyad, to determine themselves. So part of what we've been trying to flesh out is how do we facilitate a discussion about what would be useful elements of an MOA or an MOU without actually dictating how that should look. So for example, in the related services policy that is on OSSE's website, the language in that policy articulates that, you know, there's an expectation in terms of missed services on how those services should be made up, but above and beyond that, LEAs are expected to have their own missed services policies, first that align with the OSSE related services policy, but also specifically address any specific needs that the LEA may have or requirements that the LEA has. So again, it's an example of where we're not articulating what that should be at the LEA level, although OSSE has articulated kind of a minimum standard. So we certainly have heard your request for the MOU kind of piece, and we are looking actively to facilitate a discussion where we help flesh out what that might look like in terms of some elements. But again, each respective LEA and non-public dyad is expected to really flesh that out for what the specific needs of that LEA are. Can the DC CATS information go out? I'm not sure I have access. If you send us, you can send it to me, edgar.stewart@dc.gov, an email after you know, today. I could follow up with you to find out about specific access issues that you may be having. For those of you who are new to either a non-public school or to an LEA and either are unfamiliar with DC CATS or don't believe you have access, again, you know, you can follow up with us and we can, you know, look into those issues as well to figure out whether you need to get access or reset the access if you might have it. Where will the October 1st training be? Will we get an email about it? In fact, well, the October 1st training will be here at OSSE in, I believe it's 806A and B on the 8th floor, and all of you should be subscribed to the LEA Look Forward, and it's coming out in today's issue. So look for it in the announcement section. One significant change, and this is primarily for the non-public schools, one significant change in our dissemination of information process that you all should know about is that we're using the LEA Look Forward, and I know you're non-public schools, but the LEA Look Forward is our primary communication vehicle for information and announcements about events that are taking place, like this training, the October 1st training, the bi-monthly non-public SEDS POC webinars. So what we have done is to add all of the contact information that we have for non-public school contacts to the LEA Look Forward distribution list. By the fact that you're on this call, I hope what that means is that you were able to receive notification about this training via the LEA Look Forward. One of the things, if you don't feel like you've gotten it, information about this training or the upcoming training through the LEA Look Forward, I'd encourage you to check your either spam or junk mail folders or the filters that are used to see if, you know, maybe it's gotten lost or it's been prevented from coming through there. In the email that we'll be sending subsequent to this webinar today, I'll include information about the subscription list to the LEA Look Forward as well to make sure you have that information. All right, so we've got about 7 minutes. I'm just going to keep going through questions until we get to the end. I want to respect your time. For SEDS, would a non-public school require different access for each LEA represented? So one of the changes we're working on, oh, I'm sorry, wait, let me go back to that question. I think, what did I do here? For SEDS, would a non-public school require different access for each LEA represented? Yes, the answer is yes. So if a non-public school is serving students from multiple LEAs, then they should be working with each LEA to ensure that the students from that LEA are showing up in the non-public schools SEDS roster. If there are overall access issues in that case, then additional assistance can be requested from OSSE for an aggregate account to ensure that the non-public school has the ability to receive and connect to each LEA. But at the end of the day, each LEA will need to grant specific access to their students to assign it to related service provider caseloads. So you will, even if you get an aggregate account from OSSE, you still will have to work with each LEA with students that you're serving. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have. So again, our contact information is here. We will be following up with an email providing you, the slides again and information about the LEA Look Forward subscription. Look out today for the LEA Look Forward for those of you who already have access to it this afternoon for information about the October 1 training. We will be in touch with you as soon as we are able to flesh out the training dates for the winter training before the January review period and for the spring training before the April review period. We thank you for your attention, and again, reach out to us with questions about the tools, the monitoring calendar, this revised process, and we look forward to working with you this year. Thank you.